In 1912, the Halpern family opened their farmhouse to children with nowhere else to go. Neighbors admired their quiet generosity, saying the couple had God's patience and a saint's heart, and the sprawling house on the edge of town was soon called a house of charity. Each window glowed with lamplight, and the air outside often carried the sweet smell of baked bread drifting from their kitchen. But kindness, when praised too often, can grow into a mask. And inside that house, where the walls seemed to lean inward as if listening, silence pressed down in ways no one could explain. Visitors spoke of the hush in the hallways, how footsteps felt swallowed before they touched the ground, how the children who lived there often stared with hollow obedience. The Halperns never had children of their own, though they accepted it with strange ease. They said their purpose was higher, to protect the innocent and give shape to broken lives. Townsfolk believed it. They saw clean clothes in the children, heard hymns sung through the windows on Sundays, and convinced themselves that goodness had taken root in the farmhouse. Yet goodness, when too perfect, hides something unspeakable. The Halperns were methodical in everything. Meal times were silent rituals, forks and knives placed with military precision, children sitting still as though the slightest movement might shatter some unwritten law. No laughter ever escaped from that table, only the clink of cutlery, the scrape of chairs, and the relentless hush that wrapped around every meal like a rope. The children came from train stations, poorhouses, and alleys where no one would claim them. At first, they looked relieved to have shelter, but within weeks their faces hardened, drained to the softness one expects from youth. Some whispered the cellar, though never in words the Halperns could hear. They spoke of the strange hours when the family moved through the house, carrying lanterns though no light was needed, arranging objects in careful patterns on the floor. The youngest ones wept quietly at night, pressing small fists against their mouths so no sound escaped. If ever a child vanished, the Halperns explained it away with solemn voices, saying a relative had come for them or that they had been placed with another household. The town accepted every word, because the Halperns looked so calm, so orderly, and the idea of evil wearing such neat clothes was too dreadful to believe. Behind their calmness was a hunger that had nothing to do with flesh or blood, but with control, with the shaping of fear into worship. The Halperns believed silence was purity. They taught the children that noise was filth, that thoughts must be cleansed, that obedience was the only proof of worth. Night after night, they drilled these lessons in voices too low for outsiders to hear, their words circling like a slow chant. When a child failed to obey, the punishment was not a strike or a shout, but a ritual of stillness, locked hours in the cellar where light could not touch them, where shapes on the stone floor hinted at patterns older than any church. The Halperns never raged. They did not need to. Their cruelty was exact, like a surgeon's blade, removing piece by piece the spark inside the young. And the children, stripped of noise and rebellion, learned to vanish inward until only shells remained. The farmhouse became a vessel for this twisted devotion. Every door creaked at the same pitch, every curtain hung the same length, every object placed at precise angles as though the house itself were an altar. Visitors saw neatness and called it discipline, not realizing the order was suffocating, a map of madness that only the Halperns could read. In their minds, charity was not kindness but possession. To give shelter was to own, to strip away, to mold life into silence. They were not saints. They were architects of emptiness. The town never knew, and perhaps they did not want to. The children kept their secrets, and the house, heavy with its impossible quiet, stood as a beacon still. Yet silence has a sound of its own. It lingers in the ear, a pressure that never lifts. And in that house of charity, silence became its own kind of voice, whispering to the years, binding every child who crossed its threshold into a fate none could escape. What began in 1912 as an act of supposed mercy grew into something darker, something ritualistic that could not be undone. For while the Halperns smiled at the world outside, within those walls they had already built a kingdom of shadows where silence reigned, and the world beyond the farmhouse would never truly hear what had been born there. The records were meticulous, names of children written in careful ink, dates of arrival noted with tidy precision, each one marked as though the Halperns feared the possibility of forgetting. But the columns never stretched outward again, never showed the expected notations of departure or adoption. A ledger of entrances with no exits, a silent catalog of the disappeared. At first, no one thought to question it. Who would? The Halperns lived with such steady grace. Their farmhouse door always open. Their pew at church filled every Sunday with bowed heads and folded hands. They gave offerings more generous than their means suggested. They smiled at every passerby, each gesture so gentle, so measured, that suspicion seemed a kind of sin. Yet paper remembers what people choose to forget, and in the stillness of those pages, the truth festered. The children arrived in ones and twos, sometimes whole siblings brought together, small hands clutching each other in fear. They were seen climbing the farmhouse steps, their thin shoes tapping against wood, their faces half hidden in shadows. But no one ever saw them walk back down. They did not play in the yard the way children ought to. No games of tag in the tall grass, no skipping stones at the creek. They were shadows behind glass, glimpses of pale faces at upstairs windows, eyes that did not wave back. The neighbors noticed, of course, but they forced the thought away. When someone asked where the children had gone, the Halperns answered softly, saying they had been placed in good homes elsewhere, or that families had reclaimed them. And because the Halperns spoke with such composure, the answers were believed. To press further would have been impolite, almost cruel. The town wanted to believe in saints, not predators. Whispers did exist, thin and uncertain, rising in the hushed corners of taverns and kitchens. A mother once confessed that she had not seen a child step outside that house for months. A farmer muttered that the air around the farmhouse felt wrong, too still, as though the fields themselves held their breath. Yet such words melted under the weight of the Halperns' public devotion. Their perfect attendance at church became its own armor. People looked at them kneeling in prayer, faces serene, and told themselves that those who praised God so openly could not possibly harbor darkness. To accuse them would be to accuse the church itself, and no one dared to disturb that fragile comfort. So the whispers were smothered, replaced with hymns and silence, and the children continued to vanish behind closed doors. Inside the farmhouse, the truth was far colder. The children were not nurtured but consumed, not with teeth or blood, but with rituals that erased them piece by piece. The Halperns did not bury bodies in the ground. They buried souls in silence. The cellar swallowed them first, that lightless pit lined with stone markings that no priest had ever blessed. The children were made to kneel in endless stillness, to strip themselves of noise, of laughter, of memory. Days bled into nights with no measure but the slow drip of water and the dry scrape of chains across the floor. Those who resisted learned despair faster, for resistance fed the Halperns' hunger. They were masters of dismantling spirit, of reducing a child to emptiness until there was nothing left to return to the world. When the final spark went out, the Halperns did not mark a grave. They did not need to. The absence itself was the grave. The silence was the soil. What unsettled most was not the lack of graves in the yard, but the lack of mourning. No cries for lost children, no rituals of farewell, no flowers laid upon the earth, only the same fixed routine. Morning prayers, quiet meals, hymns sung at the same hour, lanterns extinguished at the same mark of night. The rhythm of that household was too precise, each moment clicking into place like gears in a machine. And the children, one after another, disappeared into it until only their names remained frozen on paper. Neighbors, even years later, could not recall a single sound of childish joy from the farmhouse. No laughter had ever escaped those walls, only the flat echo of order. In hindsight, it was the absence that screamed the loudest. Decades passed before the records were examined again. By then the Halperns were gone, their farmhouse left to sag beneath the weight of dust and silence. And only then did the town reckon with the ledger, with the tally of children who had entered but never left. Questions surfaced too late, names spoken aloud with trembling lips, as if the act itself might summon restless spirits. Where were the graves? Where had the children gone? The silence offered no answer, only deepened, as though the earth itself conspired to hide what had been done. The absence of graves was more than oversight. It was a mark of ritual, a belief that the children had been undone in ways that soil could not contain, their existence erased not by death, but by transformation into something unspeakable. The farmhouse still stood on the edge of town, its windows hollow, its doors sagging open like a mouth that had told too many lies. People passed it quickly, unwilling to look for long. Yet some swore that on certain nights the silence pressed outward from the house, thick and crushing, carrying with it the faintest impression of names once written in careful ink, names that no longer had bodies to claim them. And though no graves marked the land, the ground felt heavy underfoot, as though it carried the weight of countless forgotten children whose absence would never fade. The Halpern smiling faces were long gone, but their silence remained, binding the farmhouse and the town in a shared complicity, a wound that had no place to heal. Behind the pantry door, hidden behind a row of carefully stacked sacks of flour and sugar, was a narrow staircase that led down into darkness. The Halperns called it the lesson room, a name that sounded innocent, almost nurturing, like a schoolmaster's quiet classroom. But the air that came up the stairs smelled damp and cold, carrying a heaviness that settled in the chest of any child who descended. The staircase itself seemed designed to strip away confidence, the walls pressing close enough to make the steps feel perilous, the lantern at the top dim and unsteady. Each child, when summoned, knew that passing through this door meant leaving a piece of themselves behind, though no one ever said what would be lost. The townsfolk remained unaware, of course. If asked, the Halperns would say it was a room for study, for reflection, and the town, lulled by their patience and perfect public demeanor, accepted the explanation without question. But the lesson room was never about learning in any conventional sense. It was a crucible, a place where endurance replaced education, and where mind and body were meticulously dismantled under the guise of teaching. Inside, the room was both austere and deliberate. The walls were bare stone, damp with a chill that seeped into the skin. The floor was polished until it reflected the faint glimmer of the lanterns, placed in careful symmetry, as though light itself were part of the lesson. No chairs were present, no beds or cushions, only space, empty, echoing, and unforgiving. The Halperns themselves stood at the threshold, their faces serene, eyes calm as they watched the children enter. There was never shouting, never force. The punishments were designed to make compliance inevitable, to teach fear as a slow-burning companion rather than an instant reaction. A child who faltered in attention or obedience might be asked to stand for hours in a single spot, arms lifted, until the small muscles quivered and pain became thought. Another might be told to memorize patterns of shapes etched into the walls, shapes that held no meaning outside the room, until the mind refused and melted under the demand for order. It was not physical cruelty in the usual sense. The Halperns did not need whips, nor chains, nor scars. They used patience, silence, and the terror of impossibility to carve obedience into flesh and bone. Time in the lesson room was unmeasured. Days and nights blurred into each other, a child's awareness narrowing to the next command, the next imposed stillness. Hunger was calculated, a slow companion to exhaustion, leaving the body pliable and pliant to every trial. Sleep came in stolen fragments, if at all, interrupted by exercises designed to test focus, balancing on narrow ledges, tracing shapes on the floor with trembling fingers, or repeating words until the tongue burned and the voice cracked. And always the eyes of the Halperns watched, unblinking, cataloging every twitch of hesitation, every unintentional sigh, every thought that dared wander from prescribed pattern. In those eyes there was no anger, no wrath, only certainty that every trial was necessary. Resistance itself became part of the instruction, a teaching in futility that left a child's spirit quivering, questioning its own capacity for defiance. The room seemed to breathe with the Halperns' method. Its walls were witnesses, absorbing every whispered fear and every attempt at rebellion, holding it against the child in silence. One child might be asked to kneel in the same position until skin broke, but it was not the wound that mattered. It was the attention to pain, the calculation of limits, the recognition that discomfort could be controlled, endured, and ultimately transformed into compliance. Another might be forced to walk in precise circles, tracing patterns laid into the stone floor, until dizziness and nausea blurred the edges of reality. Hunger, cold, fatigue. These were all tools of refinement, sculpting children into vessels for silence, vessels that could exist without complaint. The Halperns observed with a clinical detachment, recording the outcomes not in ink, but in the changes in posture, in the stiffened shoulders, in the hollowed eyes. The room itself became a teacher, a priest of endurance, where suffering was holy and resistance meaningless. Some children never spoke again after their first lessons. Their eyes, once bright and questioning, became windows to rooms no one could enter. They moved through the farmhouse with the careful precision of the lesson room's expectations, silent as shadows, careful to step in exact alignment with the floorboards, to eat in prescribed rhythm, to breathe only when spoken permission allowed. The Halperns considered this progress. They whispered to each other that children must learn that life required obedience before mercy, endurance before comfort, silence before thought. And when a child stumbled, they returned to the lesson room without hesitation, allowing the trials to resume, refining the lesson in infinite patience. No force, no cruelty outside the design, only the slow, inevitable shaping of body and mind until the child belonged to the room more than to the world. The townsfolk never suspected. Church attendance remained perfect. Neighbors still smiled at the Halperns' calm grace. The lesson room remained a secret, its purpose concealed behind flour sacks and polite explanation. Yet even those who did not enter the room could feel its influence. The farmhouse hummed with an unnatural quiet, a tension that clung to the walls and crept into surrounding fields. Children outside the house sometimes paused near its edges, sensing the presence of something unseen, an authority too precise to be human. And inside, the lesson room waited patient, eternal, a place where fear and endurance were inseparable, where the Halperns taught not punishment but transformation, shaping the invisible skeleton of obedience into a perfection of silence. No ledger recorded the hours spent. No one outside measured the trials. But the room counted. Every quiver, every twitch, every faltering thought was filed in memory sharper than any pen. The Halperns did not need to write it down. Their eyes remembered, and the children who emerged from the lesson room carried its lesson forever, moving through the world like ghosts of their own endurance, a silence perfected, a spirit hollowed, a mind sharpened to fear. The staircase remained hidden, waiting for the next child who would step into the darkness, not knowing that the lesson had come to be less about obedience and more about the slow, deliberate erosion of self until a world beyond the house could be faced with nothing left to give. Mr. Halpern carried a different kind of devotion than his wife, a quiet, meticulous obsession that crept through the farmhouse like a shadow that never lifted. He spent hours bent over anatomy manuals, leafing through pages of sinew and bone with a precision that bordered on reverence. To him, the human body was a clockwork instrument, every muscle, tendon, and lung a lever that could be adjusted, tested, and refined. But it was not knowledge for healing that he sought. It was mastery of endurance, the ability to measure suffering and refine it into ritual. Children were the subject of his studies, though no medical justification existed. Their limbs, their breathing, their capacity to bear silence were catalogued in his mind, recorded in experiments so cruel that the mind balked at naming them. There were no scribbled notes in a ledger, no diagrams pinned to a wall. Everything lived first in observation, second in calculation, third in execution. The most feared of Mr. Halpern's experiments involved upright wooden boxes, tall and narrow, lined with no comfort except the faint, stifling smell of pine. The first night, a child might squeeze inside voluntarily, thinking of punishment like the lesson room, a trial of patience. But the boxes were designed with intent. The wood swelled as it absorbed moisture from the farmhouse, from the very breath of the children confined within, and each night the walls grew closer, pressing against ribs and shoulders, narrowing the lungs, bending limbs into angles that did not belong to them. Sleep became impossible, a fleeting collapse rather than rest, and the mind began to bend to the inevitability of the next night. Breathing itself became an act of resistance. Mr. Halpern observed from behind a narrow slit, counting inhalations and exhalations, noting how long the body could endure before panic set in. Children learned to control their panic, to ration air and stillness as though survival were a complex equation that must be solved perfectly or punished. Silence was another experiment, equally deliberate. The Halperns did not simply demand quiet. They measured it, refined it, made it into ritual. A single cry, a cough, a gasp drew immediate correction. Children were taught to regulate their breathing, as if each inhalation carried consequence. Mr. Halpern would time it, counting heartbeats against seconds, instructing that calmness was not comfort, but a skill to be mastered. Some nights, the children were left in total darkness, air so still it felt as though the room had swallowed them. Hunger was timed to enhance compliance. Thirst allowed just enough to keep the body alert, a cruel mimicry of the discipline necessary to survive in a world they had no place in. And when a child faltered, when panic overcame calculation, the lesson was repeated with exacting precision. No rage was shown, only the quiet certainty that endurance was not negotiable, that suffering was science, ritualized and sacred. The boxes themselves became instruments of transformation. Each night the walls crept inward, forcing the body to adapt or break. Limbs grew cramped, backs curved, shoulders stiffened. The mind, too, bent to the demands, learning to predict, to anticipate the constraints, to make the impossible manageable. Children whispered to themselves, devising silent codes, small mental rituals to survive. Breaths were counted in sequences, prayers recited internally, thoughts folded neatly to avoid panic. Survival became performance. Repetition of behaviors dictated not by desire, but by the knowledge that one misstep would be noted, catalogued, judged. Mr. Halpern watched, detached, yet thrilled at the incremental mastery of the children's compliance, noting how even subtle shifts, the way a child held a shoulder, the way an eye flicked toward the slit in the wood, revealed the slow internalization of his lessons. It was not cruelty for spectacle. There was no audience, no applause, no vengeance. The suffering was methodical, deliberate, a devotion to the exactness of human limits. Mr. Halpern understood the psychology of terror, the way the mind bends when the body is confined, when comfort is withheld in measured increments, when sleep itself becomes a trial. He understood the balance between fear and endurance, between panic and ritual, and he used it to construct a curriculum of despair. The farmhouse, the lesson room, the boxes, they were all parts of a single organism, each element feeding into the other, each reinforcing the other's purpose. Children emerged from these trials altered, carrying the memory of confinement as both shadow and scaffold, a template of endurance etched into every bone and sinew. By the time a child had been subjected to a month's lessons, the wooden boxes had become familiar enemies. They fit like extensions of the body, walls pressing impredictably, air rationed carefully, breathing measured, thoughts confined. Survival had become a ritual, a daily act of calculation, a silent choreography of endurance that the Halperns demanded without spectacle, without fanfare. The mind, trained to anticipate and ration, became almost mechanical, the spirit hollowed in a way that rendered fear manageable, almost elegant. Mr. Halpern observed the transformation with clinical satisfaction. The children were no longer merely occupants of the farmhouse. They were subject to a perfected system, bodies tuned to the rules of suffering, minds conditioned to accept the inevitability of pain, hearts taught that endurance itself was virtue. Outside, the world remained oblivious. Church pews filled each Sunday with the Halpern's serene faces. Neighbors continued to whisper of kindness, of charity, of generosity. No one heard the subtle shifts in breathing, the faint creaks of wood as it swelled, the suppressed sighs of children pressed upright into a geometry of torment. No one measured the slow erosion of innocence, the transformation of laughter into silence, curiosity into compliance, wonder into ritual. And inside the farmhouse, Mr. Halpern smiled quietly at his work, a scholar of the human condition who had discovered a truth more profound than any anatomy manual could teach, that suffering, administered with precision and patience, could create a perfection of endurance, a ritual so absolute it bent the living into a shape of obedience that no one outside could imagine. Mrs. Halpern believed that hunger could be taught, sculpted, and spoken, that it could become a language through which children understood their place in the world, a grammar of obedience written upon empty stomachs. She moved through the farmhouse with the precision of a priestess, her hands arranging trays of wax apples and plaster bread, as though consecrating an altar. The fruits gleamed with perfection no orchard could offer, the loaves browned to an uncanny realism, every shadow and crease of their surfaces designed to deceive the senses. The children were called to the dining room, a space usually associated with warmth and family. But here the table of false abundance became a theater of torment. They sat in rigid silence, small hands folded in their laps, eyes wide, lips pressing against the illusion of nourishment, chewing nothing, tasting only the texture of deceit. The smell of bread, of apples, of what might have been sustenance, filled their noses and sent pangs of starvation twisting through their bellies. Hunger became both punishment and teacher, a voice louder than any shout, a lesson impossible to ignore. Mrs. Halpern circled the table like a shadow of grace, her eyes calm and calculating, her lips moving in whispered prayers for blessings upon the children's restraint. She invoked the names of saints and angels, folded scripture into ritual, as though divine attention could sanctify the children's suffering. Each prayer was precise, measured, a beat of ceremony over the hollow of stomachs. Her calm devotion made the children feel as though the hunger was holy, a trial of virtue and loyalty. Some tried to look away, to escape the illusion, but the eyes of Mrs. Halpern were everywhere, assessing, cataloging, weighing the effort restraint against the inevitable tremor of desperation. Even a cough or a slight shiver drew her notice, and the gaze that followed was enough to silence the body for hours afterward. In her mind, pain was a language, and hunger was the most articulate dialect. Every growl of the stomach, every desperate glance at the fake fruit, every suppressed cry was translated into obedience. Meals became long rituals, measured in silence and suffering. The children learned to sit perfectly still, to arrange their hands and bodies as if in worship, to resist a natural instinct to consume what looked like food. Their minds, sharp with craving, became a theater of calculation. When would the bread be lifted? What motion of her hand meant it was time to swallow air instead of sustenance? How to mask the trembling of a belly that demanded more than it could have? Hunger turned into thought, thought into ritual, ritual into survival. Mrs. Halpern watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction, noting the subtle ways the children adapted, how the spirit bent and the body submitted. She believed hunger taught the language of the world. That desire could be tamed, that longing could be codified into obedience, that the flesh could become a text for the mind to read, and that the will, when pressed hard enough, would answer in silent compliance. Some children wept quietly, hiding the sound as best they could, and Mrs. Halpern collected these soft, half-stifled cries as though they were prayers themselves. Each whimper became a hymn, a melody of endurance to which she attuned herself. She did not punish these noises in any direct way. Punishment would have been too crude, too obvious. Instead, she allowed the music of suffering to rise and fall like a tide, teaching the children that their pain had purpose, that their longing could be shaped and mastered. The table became an altar, the wax fruit a sacrament, the hollow ritual of chewing and swallowing, nothing a liturgy in which the children themselves became instruments. They learned to silence not just their mouths, but their thoughts, to anticipate what would be required before the hand moved, before the prayer was completed. Obedience became instinct, the language of hunger written into every movement, every measured intake of breath, every pulse of the body that ached with restraint. The effect of the ritual was cumulative. Over days, weeks, months, children came to associate the absence of nourishment with the presence of authority. A glance from Mrs. Halpern could make a hand drop, a stomach tighten, a mind focus entirely on control rather than need. They internalized the expectation that hunger itself was sacred, a communication from adult to child, a conversation in which silence and restraint were the only correct responses. Their small bodies began to shrink in anticipation, their eyes hollowing, but their focus sharpened, every movement precise, every thought regulated by the invisible grammar of fasting. Hunger, she believed, was more powerful than scolding, more persuasive than discipline, more truthful than touch. In this way, the children's suffering became a language he alone could read, a secret dialect in which every silent cry, every quivering breath, every ache in the stomach spelled obedience, devotion, and control. By the end of the meal, the children emerged with stomachs aching and minds trained, the ritual complete. The trays were cleared, the wax fruit stacked away, and yet the lesson lingered, etched into their bodies, written into the spaces between breaths, the hollow thrum of longing converted into compliance. Mrs. Halpern moved among them, serene and composed, sensing the rhythm of endurance in each child's posture, each subtle shift in expression. She had taught them that hunger could be read, could be translated, could be turned into devotion. Their suffering became her hymn, Their restraint her scripture, and the farmhouse echoed with the silent music of endurance. No one outside could hear it, no one could imagine it, but within the walls, Mrs. Halpern had created a language more absolute than speech, more persuasive than reason, more intimate than love itself. The language of hunger as obedience, hunger as faith, hunger as power. In the Halpern basement, the air carried a sharp tang of brine, a scent that clung to the skin and the soul alike. Wooden buckets lined the floor, filled to the brim with water so thick with salt it stung every scrape, every cut, every abrasion the children carried from their trials above. The Halperns had learned the ancient properties of salt, its power to preserve, to prevent decay, and twisted that knowledge into ritual. In their house, it preserved torment instead. Children were forced to kneel or crouch in the cold liquid, submerging tender flesh into brine as their small bodies shivered violently, the burn of salt embedding itself into muscle and nerve. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. Pain that was sharp, pure, and inescapable, a lesson written directly upon the skin. Mrs. Halpern would pace above, her voice barely audible, intoning prayers and hymns that mingled with the clink of wood and water. The melody above became a soundtrack to the children's suffering, a hymn whose notes were stitched into the sting and ache of salt, a reminder that pain and devotion were inseparable in the Halpern doctrine. Some children were made to drink the brine itself, forced to swallow mouthfuls of the bitter water until their stomachs rebelled violently. Vomiting became a ritual as precise as the prayers above, blood mingling with the salt. Each wretch catalogued silently in the Halpern's gaze. There was no malice in the act, only absolute, careful instruction. Endurance must extend to the body's most elemental limits, to the capacity of the stomach to betray itself, to the mind to witness itself break and persist. Each gulp, each heave, each trembling moment became a test of obedience, a physical language through which submission was encoded. The children learned to anticipate the orders, to brace the sting, to count each breath against the seconds of discomfort, folding the ordeal into mental routines as intricate as any mathematical problem. Pain became grammar, endurance, syntax, salt, the ink with which the Halperns wrote their lessons upon flesh. Wounds, small and large alike, were immersed in brine for hours at a time. Cuts reopened with every movement. Abrasions burned with the acrid bite of preserved torment. Yet children could not cry aloud. Noise was forbidden. Even whimpers punished subtly by Mrs. Halpern's disapproving presence, her hands folded as if watching a liturgy rather than an act of cruelty. Some children learned to bite lips until taste vanished, to focus entirely on the rhythm of the hymns, letting the cadence become a mental anchor against the raw, salt-burned sensation. The pain was total, consuming, a constant that transformed into expectation. Nights became nightmares of salt and water, bodies stiffening with cold, muscles trembling, the skin taut with burn. Yet even in torment, there was ritual, a method, a structure the Halperns imposed with quiet precision. The children understood that survival was measured in seconds, in endurance, in the silent recitation of bodily obedience. Salt water became a teacher that demanded total comprehension. It forced children to recognize the fragility of flesh, the vulnerability of the body to controlled, incremental torment. And in this recognition, a strange rhythm emerged. Shivering became meditation, retching became prayer, the sting in wounds became mantra. They learned to anticipate the burn, to position themselves in the liquid to minimize pain without escaping it entirely, to control tremors, to still their minds against the instinct to scream. Mr. Halpern observed the precision of muscle and breath, timing the endurance, noting which children adapted and which faltered. The basement became a laboratory of sensation, of submission, of ritualized suffering, where each child's body was catalogued, measured, and trained to obey the invisible rules of the Halpern house. Evenings carried a different terror. Hymns rose from the dining room or parlor above, a calm, serene soundtrack that made the basement ordeal more surreal. Children could hear the cadence of voices, the quiet satisfaction of Mrs. Halpern's devotion, and the juxtaposition twisted their perception of reality. Pain became sacred. Suffering became necessary. Endurance became the truest form of obedience. The mind, exhausted by the relentless sting, began to fold itself into ritual, internalizing the lessons of salt as though it were a moral principle rather than a torment. By the time the buckets were emptied, the brine water drained and the children's skin reddened and raw, they carried the lessons in every movement, every shiver, every quiet breath. The ordeal was more than physical. It was a reprogramming of the body, the psyche, and the perception of authority. In the Halpern house, salt preserved more than meat. It preserved obedience, etched devotion into flesh and memory, enforced a language of suffering that could be read only by those who had endured it. The children's cries, swallowed and shaped, became part of the house itself, absorbed into walls and floorboards, whispering the hiss of water against wood, remembered by the instruments of ritual, the buckets, the brine, the hymns that rose above. Each day of submersion, each mouthful forced and vomited, each burn and shiver created a continuity of suffering that bound the children to the Halpern's doctrine more tightly than any chains could. Pain became communication. Salt became scripture, and endurance became the only grammar the children would ever need to understand. In a dim corner of the Halpern house, beyond the eyes of any visitor and the reach of polite curiosity, Mr. Halpern had arranged a series of shelves, each tier lined with glass jars whose surfaces shimmered like frozen sunlight. The jars were empty to the casual glance, but to Mr. Halpern they were repositories of something far more potent, far more sacred than any artifact. The breath of the children. Each jar bore a small label, a name written in neat, unwavering script, a claim upon the essence of human life. The process was deliberate, ritualistic, and exacting. Children were called forward one at a time, small bodies trembling with a mix of fear and curiosity, and were instructed to place their mouths upon the soft rubber tubes he held. Mr. Halpern's eyes never wavered, scanning the rise and fall of their chests, calculating the tempo of exhalation, the rhythm of lungs, the subtle tremor that indicated endurance or strain. The children, obedient as they had been trained in every trial before, breathed as they were told, their awareness narrow into the tube, the glass jar, the hand that guided them. He would watch them until their bodies sagged, until the effort of respiration became laborious, until they collapsed against the wooden floor with limbs quivering. Then, with careful hands and serenity that belied the violence of the act, he would seal the jar. The sound of the lid clicking into place became the quiet punctuation of a life's ritual, a sentence rendered in glass and air. In Mr. Halpern's mind, the jar did not imprison a corpse or a spirit. It captured a fragment of existence, the final exhalation of vitality, the tangible residue of a person's endurance. Some children understood dimly that this was no ordinary exercise. Others submitted without comprehension, the obedience drilled into them by wax bread, brine, and sleepless nights compelling silence even in confusion. And yet all of them felt the weight of their breath, the hollow significance of their lungs emptied not for air, but for collection. He lined the shelves meticulously, jars arranged by size and shape, the labels facing forward so that each breath could be identified, cataloged, and remembered. There was a slow, obsessive reverence in his movements, the deliberate precision of an archivist chronicling sacred texts. The children became participants in a strange form of immortality, their exhalation preserved like insects in amber, the invisible essence of life trapped and stored. Mr. Halpern would often pause, hand hovering over a row of jars, inhaling the faint, imperceptible traces of human air, claiming to hear the subtle pulse of persistence within. He believed he could sense which children had endured longest, which had submitted fully, which had resisted the instinct to panic. Each breath was a measure of the soul, a gauge of compliance, a marker of triumph in the dark arithmetic of suffering. The act itself was not violent in the conventional sense. There were no scars left upon the skin, no bruises upon the limbs, yet the toll was profound. Children emerged pale, trembling, gasping as their lungs labored to regain equilibrium, their minds focused on control, on not crying out, on obeying even as dizziness and weakness pressed at the edges of consciousness. They came to fear the exercise less than the inevitability of failure, less than the weight of Mr. Halpern's calm judgment, less than the idea that their very breath could be taken from them and stored indefinitely. The jars became symbols, reminders of power exercised quietly but absolutely. Each child could see their name on a glass vessel and understand, on a level that bypassed words, that their existence was cataloged, that their obedience was quantified, that their life itself could be measured in volumes of exhalation. Above the basement or behind closed doors, the house continued its ordinary appearances. Meals were served, prayers recited, neighbors greeted with smiles. Yet beneath, the work of collection continued, invisible and unremarkable to all but those trapped within its walls. Mr. Halpern would often walk along the shelves, his fingers tracing labels with an almost tender care, murmuring observations as though the jars were sentient. He noted differences in rhythm, in the depth of air, in the subtle sound of effort and surrender. The collection became an archive of endurance, a testament to the total obedience he had forged in the children through hunger, brine, isolation, and ritual. To him, each seal jar was proof that the children had been measured, tested, and preserved in the most intimate and absolute way possible. The jars remained undisturbed for decades, rows upon rows of glass capturing what the world could not see. No one outside could know, and yet inside, the children were haunted by the sight, the tiny labels, the faint reflections, the knowledge that a fragment of them, the part that could never be fully reclaimed, was stored in precise, frozen perpetuity. Even as the children grew, even as years stretched beyond the farmhouse, the lesson remained. Breath could be collected, existence could be cataloged, obedience could be translated into a physical form, and control could reach beyond the immediate, beyond the tangible, beyond the human perception of life itself. In the Halpern house, air was no longer invisible, innocence was no longer safe, and the simple act of exhaling had become a ritual of absolute submission. The Halpern basement was no ordinary cellar. Every inch of its walls had been carefully constructed with layers of horsehair, ash, and dense wood, forming a buffer so complete that sound itself seemed to evaporate before it could escape. Outside, the farmhouse appeared serene and orderly, its windows glowing with warm lamplight, its doors opening to cheerful greetings for neighbors and visitors. Within, however, a different rhythm persisted. The muffled screams of children, the subtle thrum of panic, the shuffling and groaning of tiny bodies pressed into enduring trials. To the casual observer, the house radiated kindness, a haven for abandoned children, a place of charity. No one could imagine that the quiet they experienced was not natural, but meticulously engineered, a sanctuary of silence designed to hide suffering. Even when voices rose in terror, the sound never traveled beyond the thick walls. The town, lulled by the Halperns' impeccable reputation, heard nothing. They only saw smiles, watched church attendance, and noted the absence of any outward chaos. In their minds, the house was a refuge. In reality, it was a carefully concealed chamber of torment. Inside, the silence was absolute yet deceptive. A child could scream with lungs on fire, yet only a faint vibration reached the ears, an almost imperceptible quiver in the air. Mr. Halpern moved among the shelves of jars, among the brine and wooden boxes, observing the children with clinical attention. The soundproofing allowed him to operate without fear of exposure, to manipulate and control every moment, knowing that no human intervention could reach the basement. The walls themselves became participants in the ritual, absorbing terror and despair, rendering it invisible. Every footstep above carried the illusion of normalcy, while below, the children learned that pain could exist entirely out of sight, that suffering did not require an audience, that endurance was complete only when it was private and unrecorded. The construction of the walls had been intentional, almost reverent. Horsehair, soft and pliable, was packed tight, layered with ash to dull the faintest echoes. The Halperns understood the science of sound, of vibration, and of perception. They had studied how sound traveled through walls, how a scream could be diffused into nothingness, and how the human ear could be fooled. The result was a basement that functioned as both cage and laboratory, a space where cruelty could unfold unobserved, where punishment could be exacted in total isolation. Children learned quickly that outside eyes and ears could not rescue them. Even if they called, even if they cried, even if they thrashed violently, the walls rendered the effort meaningless. Silence became the invisible enforcer, a teacher of helplessness, a method of control as absolute as hunger, brine, or breath collection. Neighbors sometimes wondered why the children never ran to the road, why laughter or noise never carried beyond the farmhouse gates. The Halpern smiled and reassured them, hosted tea with immaculate charm, and showed photographs of smiling faces and thriving bodies. The truth was hidden behind layers of soundproofing, behind the careful choreography of everyday life. The silence outside became a shield for the horrors inside, the absence of complaint or disturbance reinforcing the illusion of virtue. The children's disappearance, one by one, was unnoticed, unremarked upon, as though the house itself had swallowed them quietly. Each step they took within the basement echoed only in the minds of the Halperns, recorded in their meticulous notes and cataloged in their obsessive rituals. The walls were more than physical barriers. They were instruments of psychological domination. Children internalized the quiet, absorbing the message that their suffering was private, inescapable, and unshared. The house taught them that endurance was measured not by survival alone, but by the capacity to bear in complete solitude. Those who faltered were corrected, retrained, or reabsorbed into the rituals until silence was instinctual, until the absence of sound became a language in itself. Even when children eventually emerged into the sunlight, the memory of the soundless basement clung to them, a lingering pressure, a reminder that suffering could be invisible, that obedience was not only external but internalized, encoded into every breath and movement. In the Halpern house, silence was devotion, soundlessness was control, and the town's perception of kindness was the ultimate camouflage. Every scream that never reached a neighbor's ear reinforced the family's power, their narrative of charity, and their ability to vanish the children not only from the town, but from the world's awareness entirely. Outside, life proceeded, oblivious, while inside, the soundproof sanctuary held its secrets, children enduring, children disappearing, and a house that had mastered the art concealing the horrors it nurtured so meticulously. In this way, the Halperns perfected the ultimate illusion, that silence, carefully constructed and maintained, could become the purest form of control, and that what the world saw as virtue might conceal the deepest cruelty. By the year 1920, the Halpern house had achieved a kind of impenetrable legend in the town, a place of charity, a refuge for lost children, a monument to selfless kindness. Yet behind the polished facades and smiling photographs, every trace of the children who had come and gone, or more accurately, who had entered and never left, had been meticulously erased. Official files, attendance ledgers, and orphan records had been systematically burned, the ashes scattered to the winds, leaving no paper trail that could betray the quiet horrors within. Names that once existed on government forms, names that once belonged to living, breathing children, were scrubbed, omitted, and replaced with blanks. Even within the household, any hint of their presence was hidden. Toys were rearranged, clothing burned, rooms scrubbed, and yet some remnants of memory proved impossible to fully annihilate. Small details persisted in the shadows, the faintest proofs of lives that could not be entirely contained or destroyed. A letter half written by a child, abandoned in haste and tucked behind a floorboard, bore witness in ink faded by time. Initials carved into wooden beams whispered names the Halperns could not erase. Ledger stains, darkened by years and impossible to scrub clean, bore silent testimony to numbers, presences, and the reality of children who had once been counted, held, and measured in ways both cruel and obsessive. The Halperns' methods for erasure were patient and methodical, almost ritualistic in their execution. Mr. Halpern would burn records one by one, holding each shield aflame as if consecrating it, watching the paper curl and blacken while whispering calculations about endurance, survival, and control. He understood the weight of evidence, the persistence of memory, and the power of detail. He knew that a ledger blot or a name left on a page could unravel decades of carefully cultivated myth. Mrs. Halpern followed the same devotion, scrubbing floors with ashes, polishing beams, replacing objects with indistinguishable replicas. The house itself became a machine of erasure, an organism devoted to erasing the traces of its own crimes while maintaining the appearance of sanctity. Visitors left believing in the Halperns' absolute virtue. Neighbors and local officials wrote letters praising the family's work, entirely unaware that every document that might reveal the truth had already been consumed by fire or hidden behind walls. Yet even in their perfection, small proofs of existence remained, stubborn as ghosts. A fragment of paper, brittle at the edges, could not be burned without destroying the floor beneath it. A carved initial in the attic beam could not be sanded without weakening the timber. These tiny inscriptions survived in secret, whispers of memory embedded in the house itself, echoes of lives that the Halperns could not fully possess or annihilate. Children who had lived, however briefly, left marks that time could not completely erase. A pencil smudge, a dent in the wooden chair, a half-spoken prayer scratched into the corner of a ledge. They became relics of resistance, the faint tremors of existence that persisted despite Mr. Halpern's jars, the hunger, the brine, the silence. These fragments carried meaning, if only for those who knew how to see them. A reminder that the children had been here, that they had suffered, and that the human impulse to leave a trace could not be entirely extinguished, even under the most meticulous and obsessive of regimes. The Halperns' public image grew as their private erasures multiplied. By the end of the decade, their reputation had become untouchable, mythologized as saints, as benevolent keepers of lost souls. Townsfolk marveled at the number of children the family had cared for, at the unbroken stream of charity that flowed from their doors, yet no one could substantiate the records. The absence of proof only strengthened the legend. Mystery clothed the Halperns in virtue as thoroughly as their silence cloaked the house in cruelty. They had managed to turn the disappearance of facts into a demonstration of moral excellence, convincing the world that what could not be seen must be holy. And yet behind the polished doors and pristine ledgers, the ghosts of small hands, whispered names, and faint stains lingered, preserved like invisible ink, reminders that some truths persist even in the face of absolute method. In the quiet corners of the Halpern house, those traces accumulated like dust, fragile yet persistent. They told stories the adults would never admit, recorded suffering the town would never know, and preserved in minor, stubborn ways of reality that charity had a price far darker than anyone could imagine. The disappearance of records was not merely erasure. It was an extension control, an effort to define history itself, to render memory obedient, to convert life into myth. Yet life had left its fingerprints. Tiny rebellions etched into the structure of the house, whispering truths the Halperns could not fully silence. In this way, the children survived, if only as faint, haunting traces, small resistances in the shadow of a family whose sanctity had been meticulously constructed and whose cruelty had become untouchable legend. By 1957, the Halpern farmhouse had begun to show its age. Paint peeled from the clapboard siding, shingles loosened in the wind, and the sprawling structure that had once impressed the town with its charm now bore the quiet weight of decades. The current owner, unaware of the building's grim history, had undertaken renovations to modernize the house, intending only to refresh its surfaces, to make it livable once more. It was during this work that the first secrets began to surface. A hammer struck a wall in the basement, a wall that had long been thought solid, and the sound was not met with the usual hollow echo of wood, but with a dull thud that resisted explanation. Curiosity became insistence, and the wall was pried open. Inside, cavities revealed themselves, hidden for decades deliberately. Constructed, spaces that had once served as repositories for the Halperns' private catalog of suffering. The discoveries were subtle at first. Small toys wrapped in cloth, the careful folds suggesting deliberate storage, as if each object had been preserved not for play but for memory, or perhaps for ritual. Tiny shoes, some of them stitched by hand, were found sealed in glass jars, jars identical to those Mr. Halpern had used to collect breath, the faint stench of earth and resin lingering in the air. The toys and shoes bore marks, scratches, indents, signs of use and distress, as though they had absorbed not joy but fear. It was impossible to look at them and imagine a child laughing. The objects seemed heavy with absence, weighted by the unspoken suffering of the ones who had once inhabited them. Beyond the toys and shoes, more disquieting evidence began to appear. Fragments of tiny bones lay interspersed among the wrappings, shards of ribs, fingers, and clavicles that suggested violence portioned with obsessive care. These were not whole skeletons. The Halperns had not preserved bodies, only fragments, evidence that pain itself had been measured, archived, and hidden. The arrangement of these artifacts suggested ritual. Each cavity was not chaotic but methodically organized, as if the Halperns had assigned significance to each fragment, each item, each trace of their victim's existence. Shoes were aligned toe to heel, small toys faced the same direction, and bones rested in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost symbolic. One cavity held a cluster of tiny bones alongside a folded piece of cloth in which a half-burned letter had been placed. The handwriting was faint and childish, letters smudged with tears or soot, a whisper of desperation that had survived the decades. Another compartment revealed a stack of dolls, each carefully stripped of paint in certain areas, as though the Halperns had been marking time, progress, or some internal metric of cruelty. These discoveries were more than macabre. They were a window into a mind that had sought not merely to inflict pain, but to catalog it, to make it permanent, to reduce living children into fragments of a system he could fully control. As the renovations continued, more cavities were revealed, each adding layers of horror to the emerging picture. Pieces of bone were not random. Some were wrapped in scraps of cloth that bore faint stains, yellowed and brittle, evidence of decay and possibly of bodily fluids preserved in secrecy. Objects that should have suggested comfort, soft toys, small blankets, and hand-sewn garments, were intertwined with evidence of trauma, creating an unnatural juxtaposition of innocence and violence. It became clear that the Halperns' understanding of cruelty was meticulous, calculated, and ritualized. They did not need full skeletons to assert their dominance. Fragments, carefully archived, were sufficient. Pain, compartmentalized, could be observed, cataloged, and preserved in perpetuity. The house itself had become a museum of torment, a physical manifestation of methodical obsession. What made these discoveries more psychologically chilling than the artifacts themselves was a sense of deliberate timing, the impression that the Halperns had measured their cruelty to the precise limits of endurance. The absence of full skeletons suggested control. They chose which part of their victims' bodies to preserve, which gestures of suffering to memorialize. Each fragment was a note in a ledger of torment, a ledger hidden not in ink, but in wood and plaster, behind layers of walls designed to silence both the past and the present. The fact that these remnants had survived at all, despite decades of erasure and the Halperns' obsessive attention concealment, felt like a testament to the persistence of memory itself, a counterforce to the family's meticulous attempts to annihilate proof. The fragments seemed to carry a narrative that was impossible to ignore, a story of children measured, reduced, cataloged, and made permanent without ever being acknowledged by the world above. The psychological imprint of the Halperns' actions became even more palpable as investigators and workers encountered the artifacts. The arrangement of objects suggests a mind attuned to both symbolism and ritual, a mind that treated cruelty as a form of art and science combined. Each toy, each fragment of bone, each folded cloth suggested intentionality beyond what casual cruelty might produce. The house was more than a crime scene. It was an archive of psychological dominance, a space in which methodical evil had been rendered physical, permanent, and untouchable until the walls themselves were forced open. Every cavity seemed to communicate, in silence, a meticulous record of lives transformed into objects, bodies fragmented and reduced to items that could be examined, cataloged, and observed as though they were specimens. The discovery of these cavities shattered the carefully constructed mythology of the Halpern household. For decades, the town had believed in saintly charity, in selfless service, in the power of kindness embodied by two smiling faces. The artifacts hidden in the walls revealed a deeper truth. The Halperns' charity had been a facade, a stage for cruelty meticulously performed in private. The absence of records, the disappearance of children, the jars, the brine, the soundproof basements, all were connected now by the evidence in the walls. Fragmentary, disturbing, and impossible to reconcile with the myth of benevolence. The discovery forced a confrontation with the methodical evil that had been hidden in plain sight, a realization that some acts of cruelty are designed not to be witnessed but to be eternalized in silence. As the renovations peeled back more layers, the house seemed to exhale decades of suppressed horror. The fragments, the toys, the shoes, and the letters told a story that official documents never could. Pain had been portioned, measured, and preserved as though the Halperns sought immortality through suffering. They had converted human lives into objects, created a system in which memory could be controlled. And yet even their obsessive precision could not fully erase the traces of existence. The walls, once barriers to sound and suspicion, had become receptacles of evidence, and in breaking them open, the renovations released the echoes of children who had never been allowed to speak, whose suffering had been cataloged, and whose absence had been hidden behind layers of silence and myth. The house, which had once been a symbol of charity, now bore a darker legacy, a monument to control, obsession, and the human capacity for methodical cruelty. Each cavity opened, each fragment discovered, each toy unearthed carried with it the psychological weight of decades of suffering. Visitors could see the evidence, but could scarcely comprehend the scope of the Halperns' obsession, the ritualized cruelty, or the deliberate care with which they had transformed children into artifacts. The discovery made it clear that evil had not merely occurred within these walls. It had been curated, preserved, and made permanent. Pain itself had been archived, and the archive had survived, awaiting the moment when the walls finally broke open and the silence could no longer conceal the truth. The Halperns passed quietly from the world, their deaths marked not by public reckoning, nor by legal scrutiny, but by the slow, unremarked passage of time. There was no trial, no moment of justice to punctuate the decades of meticulously concealed cruelty that had defined their lives. The farmhouse that had once stood as both a beacon of charity and a monument to hidden torment was demolished, its clapboards and shingles shattered and carted away, yet even as the building crumbled, the artifacts remained, stubbornly impervious to decay. Glass jars of trapped breath sat on shelves no longer hidden, wax apples and plaster loaves, painted with perfection to deceive the senses, were unearthed from attics and basements, and wooden boxes, stained dark by years of confinement, bore silent witness to the children who had been sealed inside. These remnants survived not only the physical destruction of the house, but the town's deliberate refusal to confront the truth, each piece a fragment of a history too grotesque for many to acknowledge, yet too persistent to be ignored forever. For decades the town of Ohio existed in a state of collective amnesia. The Halperns' names were spoken in whispers or avoided entirely, their legacy a shadow that pressed uncomfortably against the edges of everyday life. Children grew up hearing hints of the family's charitable works. Neighbors told stories of their generosity, but the air was always heavy with unspoken tension, as if the community collectively sensed the enormity of the secret they had all, in some way, been complicit in ignoring. Scholars, journalists, and local historians poked and prodded at the edges of the story, but without records, without living witnesses willing to come forward, the full scope of the crimes remained obscured. The town preferred myth over truth, kindness over horror, the facade over the fractured reality hidden behind silent walls. Yet the artifact themselves demanded acknowledgement, speaking louder than any human denial could mute. They were stubborn remnants, each one a testament to suffering, each one a declaration that evil need not be monstrous or overt to endure. It could live quietly wrapped in domestic normalcy, in smiles and prayers, in meals of wax and plaster. The jars, in particular, haunted those who encountered them. Tiny bottles lined in rows, each labeled with a name, trapped the faintest traces of life that had once belonged to children, now long gone to hold them was to feel the weight of obsessive ritual, the cold precision with which Mr. Halpern had turned breath into possession, existence into object. The wax apples and bread, meant to simulate nourishment, conveyed the subtle terror of deprivation, the psychological torture of being surrounded by abundance while consuming nothing. Wooden boxes bore the stains and dented confinement relics of trials measured in endurance. Each mark a record of agony. The artifacts, though inert, radiated intention. They were curated evil, the tangible echo of minds trained to see children not as beings to be nurtured, but as material to be shaped, catalogued, and ultimately erased. Those who handled them could not help but feel the chill of methodical cruelty, the oppressive weight of years of ritualized suffering compressed into objects that defied time. The community's silence, initially protective, gradually transformed into moral reckoning as whispers became inescapable. Rumors of the hidden cavities, the jars of preserved fragments, and the wax food surfaced in newspapers and personal accounts. And finally, after decades of evasion, the state of Ohio was forced to act. Laws governing orphan care, record-keeping, and oversight were strengthened, a direct response to atrocities no one could fully document, but everyone could feel in the memory of unearthed artifacts. The Halperns' crimes, though largely intangible in their immediate legal consequences, became a catalyst for systemic change. Their hidden cruelty, once invisible, became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unquestioned authority, the vulnerabilities of children, and the horrifying efficiency with which evil can masquerade as virtue. In this way, the house, even in its destruction, continued to shape the world, not through spectacle or punishment, but through quiet, unrelenting influence, teaching laws and ethics through the negative imprint of what had occurred within its walls. Yet perhaps the most haunting legacy of all was not in legislation or newsprint, but in the quiet psychological imprint left on the town and the object themselves. The Halperns had demonstrated a truth far older and more terrifying than any single act of violence. Evil often hides not in faces twisted with rage, nor in spectacles of blood, but in the domestic, in familiar and places where no one dares to look too closely. The farmhouse had seemed benign, sanctified by charity and church attendance, and therein lay perfection as a vessel of cruelty. The town had seen the surface, the generosity, the apparent care, and had believed it entirely. Meanwhile, behind walls and basements, and in the intimate spaces of everyday domesticity, children had endured suffering measured with the precision of ritual, and fragments of their existence had persisted in objects meticulously preserved. These traces, discovered decades later, were not just evidence. They were memory, a reminder that evil does not always announce itself, that horror can survive in silence, and that some of the most dangerous acts are those performed in quiet homes, behind polite smiles, and beneath the veneer of normalcy. As the final pieces were cataloged and stored in museums, archives, and private collections, the Halperns themselves receded into the shadows of history. Their names remained whispered, their faces recalled only in photographs, the evidence of their obsession and cruelty occupying the space between legend and proof. Scholars debated. Children learned of them in hushed, cautionary lessons, and the town eventually returned to its rhythms. But the artifact endured as reminders. Jars of air, wax food, stained boxes, carved initials, letters half-written, abandoned, and fragments of bones all communicated the same undeniable truth. Evil, the Halperns had proven, could exist not as spectacle, but as quiet dominion, invisible and patient, lasting far beyond the lives of architects. The legacy of silence they left behind was both literal and psychological, a void in which history had to be reconstructed from objects rather than testimony, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying stories are not those shouted aloud, but those preserved in the hush of ordinary life, in homes where no one dared to look. Even decades later, the memory persisted in subtle ways, a teacher finding a wax apple in a forgotten drawer, a historian noticing a carved initial in the beam of an attic, or a local resident recalling a story half forgotten about children who had vanished quietly. Each encounter was a ripple in the still waters of denial, a signal that the quiet evil of the Halperns' household had outlasted both the perpetrators and the house itself. It lingered, patient, a testament to persistence of memory, the endurance of pain, and the insidious ways in which malevolence can hide behind the ordinary, shaping both laws and consciousness long after the actors have disappeared. The final lesson of the Halperns, carried in jars, wax, and fragments of wood and bone, was that evil rarely demands recognition. It survives precisely because it can be invisible, silent, and patiently embedded in the spaces we trust most. And in that silence, in that quiet domesticity, the truth waits, eternal and unyielding, for anyone brave or unfortunate enough to look.